Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Mm.
Today we're going below decks on the Titanic.
Below decks.
Yeah, to explore the often forgotten world of the ship's third-class passengers.
That's right. I think, most people when they hear Titanic,
Right.
they picture the grand staircase or,
Yeah.
the opulent dining room.
Exactly.
But the reality is, the vast majority of the people on board
Yeah.
were traveling in third class.
And their experiences were very, very different than the first-class passengers.
Exactly. They really were, and surprisingly comfortable.
Okay, so paint me a picture then. What was third-class travel like back then?
Well, you got to understand, on most ships at the time,
Okay.
third class was basically steerage.
Steerage.
Yeah, I mean, it was overcrowded.
Oh, so bad.
It's pretty rough. Yeah, you'd have dozens of people crammed into a single space.
Oh.
It was very, very basic conditions.
So the Titanic was different.
Very different. Yeah, the designers of the Titanic, they were actually quite progressive for their time. They recognized that all passengers, regardless of their social standing, deserved a certain level of comfort and dignity.
So what kind of accommodations did they have then in third class?
So picture this spacious public areas like dining saloons and smoking rooms.
Okay.
And these weren't just cramped utilitarian spaces. They were designed with some pretty good detail, really quite impressive craftsmanship for the time. And even the cabins themselves were clean and comfortable,
Wow.
typically accommodating 2 to 4 people.
2 to 4. That's a far cry from the dozens we were just talking about.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It was a big difference. And in fact, the Titanic even offered
Wow.
2 berth cabins in third class, which was unheard of
Really?
on pretty much every other ship. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Oh.
Okay, what about the food?
Well, the food in third class was hearty.
Right.
It was plentiful. It was simple fare,
Okay.
like porridge and herrings and boiled potatoes,
Okay.
which, to us today, that doesn't sound like much, but it was actually a pretty significant improvement over what was typically served,
Wow.
in other ships' third class or steerage.
So it sounds like the White Star Line was really trying to do something different here.
They were. Yeah. I mean, I think part of it was a business decision.
Okay.
They wanted to attract a wider range of passengers to
Yes.
compete with the other lines, not just on luxury,
Right.
but on overall passenger satisfaction.
I see. So appealing to a broader market.
Exactly. But I also think there was a genuine belief that all passengers deserve to be treated with a certain level of
Yeah.
respect. Remember, this was a time of great social change.
Right.
Ideas about class and equality were evolving.
Of course.
And I think the Titanic in many ways reflected those changing attitudes.
So comfortable cabins, decent food, and a company that's actually trying to make the experience better for all its passengers.
Yeah.
This is really changing the picture I have in my head of third class on the Titanic.
It was a very different experience than what most people imagine,
Yeah.
For many passengers, it was actually more comfortable than even second-class accommodations on other ships.
Now, can we talk a little bit about who these passengers were?
Sure.
It seems like such a diverse group of people.
Yeah. I mean, you had people from all walks of life from all over the world, each with their own unique story
Yeah.
and reason for being on that ship. Families, individuals,
Right.
young and old, all bound together by this shared experience
Yeah.
of crossing the Atlantic.
And the demographics tell us a lot about the world back then, right?
Absolutely. Most of these passengers were immigrants seeking a new life in America.
So they were leaving behind poverty and hardship.
Yeah, they were, looking for a better future on the other side of the Atlantic.
That's fascinating. So the Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a symbol of hope for so many people.
Exactly. And the fact that they were traveling in relative comfort
Yeah.
makes their stories even more compelling. It wasn't just about enduring the journey.
Yeah.
It was about embracing the experience, forming bonds, experiencing moments of joy and connection along the way.
So much to uncover here. I'm already hooked.
Yeah.
What should our listeners be thinking about as we delve deeper into these individual stories?
Well, I think about this. Who were these people? What were their hopes and dreams, and
Right.
how did their experiences on the Titanic, both the good and the tragic, shape their lives and the lives of those around them?
We'll unpack all of that and more when we come back for part 2 of this deep dive.
We're back and ready to dive into those individual stories like you mentioned.
Yeah, it's really amazing to think that a single ship held this whole microcosm of the world.
You had people from all over facing all sorts of challenges, hoping for a better life.
Let's start with those Scandinavians we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
They were escaping poverty, but what was life like for them back home?
So imagine rural Scandinavia at the turn of the century, small villages, harsh winters, very limited opportunities.
Tough.
It was tough. Yeah, a lot of them were farmers or laborers just scraping by. Land was scarce, families were large.
So when they heard about this vast, fertile land in America,
It was like a beacon of hope, especially the American Midwest with all that land for homesteading.
the chance to finally own their own farms,
Exactly, something
Okay.
that was pretty much impossible back home.
and the Titanic with its improved conditions was their ticket to get there.
Yeah, I mean, for many of them, this journey wasn't just about escaping hardship. It was about reaching a place where they could truly thrive.
It's kind of bittersweet, isn't it? That brief glimpse of comfort before the tragedy.
It really is.
Now, the Lebanese passengers, they were facing a different set of challenges, right?
They were mainly Maronite Christians living in the Ottoman Empire.
Which was predominantly Muslim.
Exactly. And they faced a lot of discrimination, in many aspects of life.
So for them, it wasn't just about finding better jobs. It was about religious freedom,
It was, they yearned for that religious liberty.
which America was known for.
Right. But it's also worth noting that the silk industry, which was a major source of income for many Lebanese, was declining at the time.
So it's a push and pull, fleeing hardship, but also being drawn to opportunity.
Exactly. And, we see those same forces at play with immigrant groups today.
That's true.
It's a timeless story, really.
And then there were the Armenian passengers. Their situation was especially dire.
It was, the early 20th century was a very difficult time for Armenians in the Ottoman Empire.
Right. They were facing increasing violence and oppression.
They were, what we now recognize as the prelude to the Armenian genocide.
So they were essentially fleeing a humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, you could say that and just imagine the fear and desperation they must have felt.
It's hard to even imagine.
It is, and it's just a cruel twist of fate that they sought safety on a ship that would meet such a tragic end.
It really highlights the vulnerability of those fleeing persecution.
It does. They had very limited options, few resources, and they placed their trust in this grand ship.
Only to have their hopes dashed.
It's heartbreaking, and it makes you think about the refugee crises we see today.
It does the desperate journeys, the search for a safe haven.
Yeah, the parallels are definitely there.
Now, we've talked about the Scandinavians, the Lebanese, the Armenians, but the largest group on board were the British and Irish, Ray.
They were, yeah.
What drew them to the Titanic?
Well, for them, it was often a mix of things.
Okay.
Economic hardship was a big factor, Jobs were scarce in certain parts of Britain and Ireland,
Right.
while America offered more opportunities.
So they saw America as a land of opportunity, too much like the Scandinavians.
Yeah, but there were other reasons, too. Some were just, seeking adventure, a fresh start. Some were joining family members who had already emigrated.
Like Goldsmith family we discussed earlier.
Exactly. They wanted to start a new life in Detroit.
Their story really captures that mix of hope and tragedy.
It does. They represent so many families who boarded the Titanic with dreams of a brighter future.
Dreams that were ultimately cut short.
Yeah, and little Frankie Goldsmith's excitement about being on the Atlantic. It just underscores that innocence and optimism that so many passengers carried.
It's a stark reminder that this tragedy affected people from all walks of life.
It did. And, their reasons for being on board were as diverse as the passengers themselves.
As we move into the events of the sinking in our next segment,
Right.
it's important to remember that these weren't just statistics.
Exactly.
These were individuals with hopes, dreams, and loved ones.
They were real people. And their experiences, both the joyful moments aboard the ship and the harrowing moments of the disaster, really offer us a glimpse into the human drama that unfolded that night.
A story that continues to captivate us all these years later.
It does, yeah. The human element, the mix of hope and despair,
Right.
the sheer scale of it all.
I'm eager to hear more about what happened that night. We've talked about all these passengers, their hopes, their reasons for making this journey, and the surprisingly good conditions they had in third class. But now we have to talk about the sinking.
Yeah.
We left off with that steward feeling the ship shudder after hitting the iceberg. What happened next?
It's interesting. The immediate aftermath wasn't the scene of total chaos.
Really?
No, not really. I mean, most passengers, especially in third class, they had no idea what had happened.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of them were already asleep, and the impact itself wasn't this huge jarring event.
So no one running through the hall screaming?
Not right away. No, There were some subtle signs, though.
Yeah.
Some passengers said they felt the ship tilt a little, or they heard this grinding noise, almost like scraping against something.
Makes sense.
Others mentioned a hissing sound, which we now know is probably air escaping from the damaged compartments.
So how did the crew respond?
Well, Captain Smith was told almost immediately, and he ordered an assessment of the damage. And it quickly became clear that the situation was very bad.
Yeah, I imagine.
Water was pouring into multiple compartments, and the ship was definitely starting to sink.
So then how were the passengers told about all this?
Well, this is where things get really tragic.
Yeah.
The evacuation was chaotic. Communication was a big problem.
I bet.
You had language barriers, and the layout of the ship with all the corridors and stairwells made it really tough to spread the word.
So you're saying a lot of the passengers, especially those in third class,
Yeah.
they didn't even know what was happening until it was too late.
That's right. And a lot of the accounts from survivors described this confusion, this terror, as they were finally told to put on life belts and head up to the boat deck.
I can only imagine that panic.
Oh, it must have been awful being jolted awake in the middle of the night.
Right.
Told to evacuate, then trying to navigate this unfamiliar and crowded ship in the dark.
It's just horrifying. Did any of the third-class passengers make it onto the lifeboats?
Some did, yes, but tragically far too few.
Why?
Well, the evacuation wasn't organized or fair, you see.
Right.
It quickly became every man for himself.
Of course.
And first and second class passengers were given priority. So by the time a lot of the third class passengers got up to the boat deck, most of the lifeboats were already gone.
Was anything done to help the third-class passengers specifically?
I mean, there were definitely crew members who acted heroically, trying to keep things in order and guide people to safety.
Yeah.
But the scale of the disaster and the lack of clear procedures, it just created a situation that was almost impossible to manage.
It's just such a stark reminder of the inequalities back then.
It is, even in the face of a disaster, like this class played a role in who survived.
It really shows how those social structures can impact our very survival.
It does.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the lives of these third-class passengers,
Yeah.
what's the most important thing you want our listeners to take away from this?
I think it's so important to remember the human element of this tragedy. These weren't just nameless faces lost at sea.
Right.
They were individuals with hopes and dreams.
Yeah.
They were fleeing hardship, looking for opportunity, building communities on board that ship. And even though their stories end in tragedy, they're really testaments to the resilience of the human spirit.
That's a good point. Thanks for guiding us through this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, I hope their stories continue to resonate, reminding us of the importance of empathy, compassion, and the shared human experience that connects us all.
Thanks for listening, everybody. And be sure to join us next time for another deep dive